In the 1970s, the reading of a last will and testament became a spectator sport in Britain. As the golden generation of stage and screen began to fade, a new cast of characters entered the wings: the young, glamorous, and fiercely ambitious wives. These women walked down the aisle with men old enough to be their grandfathers, exchanging their youth for the promise of a life-changing inheritance. While the public saw romance, the families saw robbery. Today, we expose the 10 most controversial unions where the wedding ring was seemingly just a down payment on the estate. Subscribe and comment, was it devotion or a long game? Let us begin. Lynn Frederick. In the lexicon of British celebrity scandals, few names evoke as much vitriol as Lynn Frederick. In 1977, the 22-year-old actress married Peter Sellers, a comedic genius whose health was rapidly disintegrating. Sellers was 51, but his heart was that of a man in his 80s, battered by a series of massive coronaries and reliant on a pacemaker to keep the rhythm of his life. To the cynical observers of the London social scene, this was not a wedding. It was a vigil. Sellers was a man living on borrowed time, possessing a fortune estimated at over £4.5 million, a staggering sum in that era, along with properties in Switzerland, France, and California. The narrative was written before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry. The young beauty was waiting for the final curtain to fall. The marriage itself was a turbulent roller coaster of emotions. Sellers was notoriously difficult, prone to dark moods and obsessive jealousy. However, for a young woman with ambition, the trade-off was clear. She became the gatekeeper to the ailing star, managing his medication and his moods. During the late 1970s, as Sellers' health declined further, Lynn's control over his affairs tightened. Friends of the actor, including his former colleagues from The Goon Show, found it increasingly difficult to contact him. The children from his previous marriages, Michael, Sarah, and Victoria, were slowly pushed to the periphery, their access to their father restricted by the new lady of the manor. The atmosphere in their luxury flat was one of tense anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath for the inevitable announcement. The drama reached its peak in the summer of 1980. It is a well-documented fact that Sellers was in the process of divorcing Lynn Frederick at the time of his death. He had reportedly instructed his solicitors to draft papers to cut her out of his will and end the marriage, citing irreconcilable differences. The waiting game seemed to be ending in a loss for the young wife. However, fate intervened in the most dramatic fashion possible. Just days before the divorce papers were to be signed, Sellers suffered a massive, fatal heart attack at the Dorchester Hotel. Because the paperwork had not been finalized, Lynn Frederick remained his legal next of kin. When the will was read, the shockwave was felt across the nation. Peter Sellers had left almost his entire estate to Lynn Frederick. His children, the flesh and blood he had seemingly adored in his erratic way, received a paltry sum of roughly £800 each. The young widow inherited the Swiss accounts, the art collection, the royalties from the Pink Panther franchise, and the sprawling properties. The British public was horrified. The press painted her as the ultimate Black Widow, a woman who had successfully waited out the clock and walked away with the jackpot. The image of her at the funeral, veiled and weeping, was dissected by tabloids who questioned the sincerity of her grief versus the magnitude of her gain. The aftermath was a protracted legal and emotional battle. The Sellers children were forced to fight for a share of their father's legacy, a humiliating public spectacle that further cemented Lynn's reputation as the villain of the piece. She held onto the estate with an iron grip, famously stating that Peter wanted her to have it all. However, the money did not bring her happiness. The pressure of being the most hated woman in Britain, combined with her own personal demons, led her down a dark path. She spent the inheritance rapidly, struggling with substance issues and a series of subsequent marriages. She died in 1994, barely reaching her 40s, leaving behind a legacy forever tarnished by the fortune she inherited. Her story remains the definitive cautionary tale of the 1970s. A young woman who gambled on a dying man's heart and won the bank, but lost her soul in the process. Clarissa Kay. In 1971, the velvet-voiced legend of British cinema, James Mason, surprised the world by marrying Clarissa Kay, an Australian actress who was virtually unknown to the general public. Mason was 62, a Hollywood veteran with a career that spanned decades and a fortune to match. Clarissa was significantly younger and, according to the whispers in the industry, significantly more ambitious. She had secured the role of the devoted wife to a man who was entering the twilight of his life, but the dynamics of their union quickly raised eyebrows in the exclusive enclaves of Switzerland where Mason had made his home. To the outside observer, it appeared to be a classic case of an aging star seeking a nurse with a pretty face, but the reality was far more calculated. From the moment the ring was on her finger, Clarissa began a systematic campaign to isolate James Mason from his previous life. The most tragic casualties of this new regime were Mason's two children from his first marriage, Morgan and Portland. They found their access to their father increasingly restricted by a stepmother who viewed them not as family, but as competitors for the actor's attention and, more importantly, his estate. Clarissa appointed herself as the gatekeeper, screening his calls, filtering his mail, and deciding who was allowed to cross the threshold of their sprawling Swiss villa. The house in Corso, overlooking Lake Geneva, became a fortress, and Clarissa held the only set of keys. As the 1970s progressed, Mason's health began to falter, and his dependence on Clarissa grew. She used this leverage to orchestrate her own professional advancement, insisting that she be cast in his films as part of a package deal. However, her primary focus remained the consolidation of his assets. Friends of the actor described a man who was terrified of upsetting his young wife, walking on eggshells in his own home to avoid her volatile temper. The narrative that began to emerge was one of a man who was being held hostage by his own marriage, a prisoner in a gilded cage that he had paid for. The devoted wife act was seen by many as a long game, a patient wait for the inevitable moment when she would become the sole mistress of the manor. The climax of this domestic tragedy arrived in 1984 when James Mason passed away from a heart attack. The reading of the will was a moment of sheer horror for his children. Clarissa Kay had succeeded in her campaign. She was named the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. The children, Morgan and Portland, were left with absolutely nothing. No money, no mementos, and no share in the legacy of their famous father. The Swiss villa, the art collection, the royalties, and the liquid cash all transferred instantly to the woman who had spent the last decade guarding him like a dragon guarding gold. It was a brutal, total victory for the second wife. The cruelty did not end with the bank balance. In a final, twisted act of possession, Clarissa refused to release James Mason's ashes to his children. She kept the urn in the Swiss house, denying them a place to mourn or a chance to say goodbye. For years, the remains of one of Britain's greatest actors sat on a mantelpiece, a trophy of a marriage that had effectively erased his past. Clarissa lived out the rest of her days in the comfort of the fortune she had secured, dying 10 years later. To this day, her name is synonymous with the wicked stepmother archetype in Hollywood history, a woman who married a legend and ensured that his own bloodline was left out in the cold. Lawrence Harvey. By the icy winter of 1972, Lawrence Harvey was a ghost of the dandy who had captivated the world in Room at the Top. Once the epitome of the chain-smoking, silk tie-wearing British heartthrob, Harvey was now waging a losing battle against stomach cancer that was consuming him from the inside out. At just 44 years old, he looked decades older, a skeletal figure retreating into the shadows of his Hampstead mansion. However, as his life force dwindled, the battle for his assets was just heating up. The central player in this macabre drama was Pauline Stone, a stunning Vogue cover model who was significantly younger and notoriously ambitious. She was the mother of his child, Domino, but she was not yet his wife. The clock was ticking, not just on Harvey's life, but on the window of opportunity to secure the legal title of Mrs. Harvey and the immense fortune that came with it. The situation was complicated by the fact that Harvey was still legally married to the immensely wealthy American widow Joan Cohn. For months, a bitter and frantic legal war was waged across the Atlantic. Pauline Stone was desperate to finalize the divorce from Cohn so she could marry the dying actor before he took his final breath. It was a race against biology, played out in the offices of high-priced solicitors. The press at the time sensed the urgency. The headlines were less about romance and more about the logistics of inheritance. Pauline knew that if Lawrence died while still married to Joan, her position and the financial future of her daughter would be precarious at best. She needed the ring to unlock the safe and she was determined to get it. The divorce from Joan Cohn was granted in the final days of 1972 amidst a flurry of paperwork and payouts. With the ink barely dry, Lawrence and Pauline were married on New Year's Eve at his home. The ceremony was a somber affair, far removed from the glitz of a celebrity wedding. The groom was visibly frail, reportedly barely able to stand, propped up by the sheer will to settle his affairs. To the cynical observers of the London social circuit, it was a deathbed marriage in the truest sense. The vows were exchanged in the shadow of the reaper, a legal formality designed to ensure the transfer of property rather than a pledge of eternal future. The honeymoon was spent administering pain medication and preparing for the inevitable funeral. Lawrence Harvey died just months later, in May of 1973. The timing of the marriage proved to be a masterstroke of financial planning. Pauline Stone, now the grieving widow, inherited the bulk of his estate, which included the London mansion, substantial investments, and the rights to his image. The transition from model to multimillionaire widow was complete. However, the victory was Pyrrhic in the eyes of the public. The tabloids painted a picture of a woman who had practically pushed the priest to the bedside to secure the bag. The narrative was harsh. She had married a corpse to inherit a kingdom. While she claimed it was an act of love to legitimize their daughter, the sheer speed of the proceedings left a bitter taste in the mouths of Harvey's oldest friends. The legacy of this frantic union was complex. Pauline Stone eventually remarried, specifically to the founder of the Hard Rock Cafe, further cementing her status in the upper echelons of wealth. However, the fortune secured from Harvey came with a heavy emotional tax. Their daughter, Domino Harvey, who was the innocent pawn in this inheritance chess game, grew up in a world of immense privilege but profound instability, eventually becoming a bounty hunter and dying tragically young. The story of Lawrence Harvey's final months serves as a grim snapshot of the 1970s, a decade where the line between a romantic farewell and a business transaction was often blurred by the glare of a diamond ring and the scratching of a solicitor's pen. Peter Finch. By the mid-1970s, Peter Finch was not just an actor. He was a force of nature who had lived a dozen lives in the span of one. A hard-drinking, womanizing Australian who had conquered the British stage and Hollywood, Finch was a man whose reputation for excess was as legendary as his talent. However, the physical toll of his lifestyle was becoming impossible to ignore. His face was lined with the geography of too many late nights, and his heart was a ticking time bomb, weakened by years of alcohol and stress. In 1973, amidst this personal decline, Finch shocked the establishment by marrying Aletha Barrett, a Jamaican hairdresser who was significantly younger than him. In the racially stratified and class-obsessed world of the 1970s British elite, this union was viewed with open hostility. The cynicism surrounding the marriage was thick enough to cut with a knife. The tabloids and the industry gossips painted a cruel picture. Here was an aging, fading lion, desperate for a nurse and a status symbol, and there was a young woman who had supposedly hit the jackpot. The narrative was that Aletha was simply waiting out the final act of a man who was clearly on a downward spiral. Finch was suffering from severe heart issues, a fact that was well known in his inner circle. To the outside world, Aletha had secured a ring on the finger of a man who was already living on borrowed time. The whispers in the corridors of power suggested she was positioning herself to inherit the legacy of a man who could not possibly last much longer. The reality of their life in the 70s was a mixture of genuine passion and the terrifying specter of mortality. Finch was pushing himself to the brink, delivering the performance of his life in the film Network, while his body was screaming for rest. Aletha was not just a passive observer, she was the one picking up the pieces, managing a man who was notoriously difficult to control. However, the public perception remained fixed on the transactional nature of the relationship. She was the outsider who had swooped in at the 11th hour to claim the prize. The tension was palpable, with Finch's established circle often treating her with a cold detachment, viewing her as the beneficiary of a will that was about to be read. The inevitable tragedy struck in January of 1977. Peter Finch suffered a massive heart attack in the lobby of the Beverly Hills Hotel, dying almost instantly. He was only 60 years old, but his body was worn out. The timing was cinematic in its cruelty. He died just months before the Academy Awards, where he was the frontrunner for Best Actor. Suddenly, the waiting game that the press had accused Aletha of playing came to a dramatic conclusion. She was now the widow of a legend, thrust into the global spotlight not as his wife, but as the keeper of his flame. The climax of this saga occurred at the Oscars ceremony later that year. Peter Finch became the first actor to win the award posthumously. Aletha Barrett walked onto the stage to accept the golden statue, a moment of supreme vindication and intense scrutiny. She held the symbol of his life's work in her hands, the ultimate inheritance. While the critics had whispered about her motives for years, she was the one standing in the glare of the flashbulbs, holding the legacy that everyone else had coveted. She had married a dying man, yes, but she had also walked him to the door of immortality. Whether it was love or leverage, Aletha walked away with the history, leaving the doubters in the shadows. Jean Le Mesurier. In the pantheon of British television icons, few were as universally beloved as John Le Mesurier. As the diffident, aristocratic Sergeant Wilson in Dad's Army, he was a national treasure, embodying a gentle, weary charm that captivated millions. However, his private life was a chaotic melodrama that would have stunned his adoring public. At the center of this storm was his third wife, Joan Le Mesurier. Joan was younger, vibrant, and possessed a restless energy that stood in stark contrast to John's passive, gentlemanly nature. To the tabloids of the 1970s, she was the woman who had not only broken his heart, but had returned to claim his legacy. The saga began with one of the most infamous love triangles in British show business history. In the late 60s, Joan had abandoned John and their children to embark on a passionate, volatile affair with his best friend, the tortured comedian Tony Hancock. It was a betrayal that played out in the public eye, humiliating John, who responded with a heartbreakingly civilized acceptance. However, when Hancock committed suicide in 1968, Joan returned to the marital home. The cynical whispers in the industry were deafening. The prodigal wife had returned not out of love, but because the safe option was still available. John, ever the gentleman, took her back, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Throughout the 1970s, as Dad's Army reached the peak of its popularity, John's health began a slow, alcohol-fueled decline. He was a functioning alcoholic, often seen in the jazz clubs of London, visibly withering away. Joan, having secured her position back at the head of the table, was viewed by many of John's oldest friends with deep suspicion. They saw a woman who had realized that the grass was not greener on the other side and had returned to ensure her future was secured by the steady income of a television star. She was the gatekeeper to a man who was too polite to ask for a divorce, managing his affairs while he slowly drank himself into oblivion. The waiting game in the Le Mesurier household was a quiet, melancholy affair. John was known to be incredibly generous, often to a fault, and there were concerns that his inability to say no was being exploited. While he worked tirelessly on set, delivering his lines with that trademark vagueness, his home life was dominated by the knowledge that his liver was failing. Joan was the constant presence, the woman who would inevitably inherit the estate of the man she had once publicly left. The narrative was cruel but persistent. She had gambled on the exciting lover, Hancock, lost, and then returned to cash in on the loyal husband. John Le Mesurier died in 1983, leaving behind a legacy of kindness and a substantial estate generated by the endless reruns of his work. Joan inherited the royalties, the rights, and the status of being the widow of a comedy legend. She later wrote a memoir detailing her affair and her life with John, a move that some critics viewed as a final attempt to monetize their complicated history. Her story in the 1970s is a complex web of forgiveness and pragmatism. She was the wife who came back, but for the critics who watched John fade away in the haze of smoke and whiskey, the question always remained, did she return for the man, or did she return for the security that only a dying legend could provide? George Sanders. George Sanders was the epitome of the suave, cynical British gentleman. With a voice like oiled silk and a sneer that could curdle milk, he won an Academy Award for All About Eve and voiced the terrifying Shere Khan in The Jungle Book. However, by the dawn of the 1970s, the man who had played the ultimate cad was a crumbling ruin. A stroke had left him struggling with his speech, a cruel irony for an actor whose voice was his fortune. He was suffering from deep depression and the onset of dementia, a fading giant wandering through a world he no longer understood. It was in this state of vulnerability that he entered into one of the most bizarre and transactional unions in Hollywood history. In 1970, Sanders married Magda Gabor, the elder sister of Zsa and Ava. The Gabors were famous not for their talent, but for their marriages. They were the original socialites who turned matrimony into a profitable business model. The wedding was viewed by the press as a grotesque spectacle. George was 64 but looked 80, a man clearly in the grip of a physical and mental breakdown. Magda, though not a young starlet, was a professional wife, a woman who knew the value of a title and a legacy. The industry whispered that she was collecting a legend, adding the Sanders name to her collection like a piece of fine jewelry before the inevitable end. The marriage was a disaster from the moment the vows were exchanged. It lasted only 32 days. Sanders, in his lucid moments, seemed to realize that he had been cast in a farce. The happy home that Magda had promised was an illusion. She was a socialite who needed a bustling life of parties and appearances, while George was a man who craved the silence of the grave. He was essentially a prop in her social climbing, a famous name to parade at dinners, despite the fact that he could barely hold a conversation. The swift annulment was a public humiliation, a final indignity for a man who had once been the master of every room he entered. The tragedy of George Sanders came to a head in 1972. Alone, bankrupt of spirit, and physically deteriorating, he checked into a hotel in Castelldefels, Spain. He swallowed 5 bottles of Nembutal and left behind a suicide note that became as famous as his films. "Dear world, I am leaving because I am bored. I feel I have lived long enough. I am leaving you with your worries in this sweet cesspool. Good luck." It was the exit of a man who had realized that his value as a human being had been eclipsed by his value as a commodity. While Magda Gabor did not inherit a vast fortune, Sanders had spent much of it, she inherited the cachet of being his ex-wife, a title she wore until her own death. The brief, loveless union in the early 70s stands as a stark example of the vulture culture of the era. George Sanders was a dying lion, and the marriage to Magda was seen by many as the final circle of the scavengers. He was a man who needed care and dignity. Instead, he got a month-long circus with a woman who specialized in marrying famous men. It was a bleak, heartbreaking end to a life of sophisticated brilliance. Susie Hunt. By 1976, Richard Burton was a monument to excess, a Welsh legend whose liver was working as hard as his agent. He was a man who had earned millions and spent millions, living a life of diamonds, yachts, and vodka. However, the one thing he could not buy was immortality. At 50 years old, he looked like a man of 70, ravaged by a lifetime of heavy drinking and the emotional exhaustion of his 2 marriages to Elizabeth Taylor. It was in this state of physical and emotional fragility that he set his sights on Susie Hunt, a glamorous model and the wife of Formula One champion James Hunt. To the British press, the union was less of a romance and more of a hostile takeover. Burton, desperate for a nursemaid and a trophy, reportedly paid James Hunt a staggering divorce settlement, essentially a transfer fee, to free Susie from her marriage. The wedding took place in August of 1976, just weeks after Burton's second divorce from Taylor. Susie was 28, beautiful and poised. Burton was a crumbling ruin. The industry perception was brutal. Susie had swapped a fast car driver for a slow-dying actor. While James Hunt could offer excitement, Richard Burton could offer an empire. The waiting game narrative was fueled by Burton's own reckless behavior. He was frequently hospitalized, his health a constant headline in the tabloids. The unspoken assumption was that Susie had stepped into the role of the final wife, the one who would be standing there when the music stopped, holding the keys to the Swiss bank accounts. For Susie, the reality of life with Burton was far from a fairy tale. She was thrust into the role of a full-time carer for a man who was fighting a losing battle with his demons. Burton was possessive, jealous, and terrified of being alone. He lavished her with gifts, furs, jewels, and properties, using his wealth to bind her to him. It was a golden cage where the bars were made of Cartier diamonds. The public saw the glamour, but the private reality was a young woman managing the decline of a national treasure. She was the buffer between Burton and the world, the one who had to hide the bottles and manage the dark moods of a genius in decay. The marriage became a war of attrition. Burton's health crises were frequent, and with every hospitalization, the speculation about his will intensified. Susie was viewed by the Burton Circle, the hangers-on and old drinking buddies, as the interloper who had secured the bag at the 11th hour. They whispered that she was simply biding her time, tolerating the chaos of his alcoholism for the promise of the widow's pension. It was a deeply cynical view, but one that was common in the misogynistic atmosphere of the 1970s entertainment industry, where young wives were often treated as suspects in a crime that hadn't happened yet. The union ended in divorce in 1982, just 2 years before Burton's death. While Susie did not become the Widow Burton, that title eventually went to Sally Hay, she walked away with a settlement that set her up for life. The transfer fee had paid off. She had given 6 years of her youth to a dying legend, acting as his nurse, his muse, and his crutch. In the cold calculus of the 70s, it was a transaction that defined her public image. She was the woman who had been bought by Richard Burton, a living testament to the fact that, while you cannot buy health, you can certainly lease companionship for the final act. Her story remains a stark example of the era's trophy wife culture, where a wedding ring was often the ultimate insurance policy. Merci à Tinker. When Rex Harrison, the undisputed king of the British stage and the quintessential My Fair Lady gentleman, announced his 6th marriage in 1978, the collective sigh from the London theatre establishment was audible. The bride was Mercia Tinker, a Singapore-born socialite who was 30 years his junior. Harrison was entering his 70s, a man whose eyesight was failing, whose temper was legendary, and whose health was a fragile house of cards. To the cynical observers of the time, Mercia was not stepping into a romance. She was stepping into a position. The role she had accepted was that of the final caretaker to a crumbling monument, a job that came with a heavy emotional price tag, but promised a golden handshake at the end. The waiting game had begun, played out against the backdrop of luxury villas in Monte Carlo and townhouses in London's most exclusive districts. The dynamic of the marriage was immediately the subject of intense scrutiny. Rex Harrison was a man who required absolute, unwavering attention. He was known to be a tyrant in his domestic life, a perfectionist who treated his wives like stagehands in the production of his own life. Mercia, however, was no shrinking violet. She was a woman of steel, described by friends as the only one capable of standing up to the sexy Rexy persona. Yet, the transaction was clear. In exchange for managing the decline of a difficult, often abusive genius, she gained access to a lifestyle of unparalleled opulence. The industry whispered that she was earning every penny of her future inheritance in real time, enduring the tantrums and the silence of a man who was terrified of his own mortality. She was the gatekeeper, the nurse, and the diplomat, smoothing over the cracks in the legend's facade while ensuring her name was firmly on the deeds. The apartment in question was not merely a flat, it was a property portfolio that spanned the globe. Harrison was a tax exile, moving between Switzerland, the French Riviera, and Manhattan to protect his vast wealth from the British taxman. For Mercia, this meant a nomadic existence, always living out of suitcases, always at the beck and call of a husband who could not pour his own tea without making it a dramatic event. The perception in the tabloids was that she was a glamorous jailer, a younger woman who had calculated the remaining years of her husband's life and decided the investment of her time was worth the eventual payout. She was frequently photographed at his side, impeccable and smiling, while he leaned heavily on her arm, a visual metaphor for the transfer of power that was slowly taking place. Behind the closed doors of their Wilton Crescent home, the reality was a grueling test of endurance. Harrison's failing health made him increasingly irascible. He was blind in one eye and losing sight in the other, a terrifying prospect for a man who had lived by his image. Mercia became his eyes, his memory, and his anchor. The waiting was not a passive act, it was an active career. She had to navigate the complex web of Harrison's previous families, including his children and ex-wives, establishing herself as the undisputed mistress of his final act. Critics argued that she was isolating him to secure the estate, cutting the cords to his past to ensure she held the future. It was a ruthless, pragmatic approach to matrimony that defined the trophy wife era of the late 70s. When Rex Harrison finally passed away in 1990, the curtain fell on one of the most complex marriages in show business. The will, as expected, was a testament to Mercia's endurance. She inherited the bulk of his substantial estate, including the properties and the royalties. The waiting game had paid off in zeros and land titles. While the public had often viewed her as the opportunist who caught the falling star, those who knew the reality of life with Rex Harrison argued that she had earned every single pound. She had provided the dignity and the care that the aging legend required, sacrificing her own freedom to be the final audience for a man who never stopped acting. Mercia Tinker walked away as the wealthy widow, the survivor of a union that was as much a business merger as it was a marriage. J. Paul Getty. While not an actor by trade, J. Paul Getty was the undisputed star of the world's most expensive soap opera, played out on the grand stage of his British estate, Sutton Place. In the 1970s, he was the richest man on the planet, an oil tycoon with a fortune so vast it was almost abstract. However, Getty was also a notorious miser, a man who famously installed a payphone for guests in his mansion to save pennies. As he entered his 80s, frail and increasingly isolated, he surrounded himself not with family, but with a harem of beautiful, hopeful women. These companions, known collectively in the press as Getty's girls, included aristocratic socialites and younger beauties who lived with him or near him, tending to his every whim. The dynamic was painfully transparent. They were waiting for the inevitable day when the old man would pass, hoping that their loyalty would be rewarded with a slice of his billion-dollar pie. The atmosphere at Sutton Place in the mid-70s was described by visitors as suffocatingly competitive. Among the women vying for the position of favorite were Lady Ursula Darboe, a glamorous British aristocrat, and Rosabella Birch, a Nicaraguan widow. They tolerated Getty's eccentricities, his coldness, and his penny-pinching lifestyle, living in a drafty mansion where the heating was often turned off to save money because the potential payout was astronomical. They were effectively in a high-stakes waiting room, nursing a man who viewed human relationships as business transactions. The press ridiculed the situation, painting Getty as a lonely king surrounded by courtiers who were checking his pulse with one hand and their bank balances with the other. Getty, however, was a master manipulator who enjoyed the power he held over his harem. He would frequently change his will, using it as a weapon to ensure compliance and devotion. He dangled the promise of inheritance like a carrot, pitting the women against each other in a cruel game of affection for assets. The girls were expected to be available for dinner, to listen to his monologues, and to provide the illusion of a vibrant social life for a man who was, in reality, deeply unhappy. It was a transaction stripped of all romance. They gave him their time and their youth, and he gave them the hope of a fortune. The waiting game came to an abrupt end in June of 1976 when Getty died of heart failure. The reading of the will was the final, brutal twist in the tale. The women who had spent years enduring his frugality and his moods were left with shocking disappointment. While they received some bequests, stocks, and small monthly allowances, the vast majority of his fortune was left to the J. Paul Getty Museum in California. Lady Ursula Darboe famously received a relatively modest sum and a few personal items, a tiny fraction of the billions she had lived alongside. The girls had gambled years of their lives on the generosity of a man who was famous for having none. The story of J. Paul Getty's final years is the ultimate cautionary tale of the inheritance trap. He used his wealth to buy companionship, but he ensured that he kept the receipts. The women who waited for his death found that the payphone in the hallway was a perfect metaphor for their relationship. You had to pay for every minute of his time, and in the end, the line just went dead. It was a stark reminder that in the world of the ultra-wealthy, the only person who truly wins is the one who writes the check. James Robertson Justice. James Robertson Justice was the booming voice of British authority, the man who played the irascible Sir Lancelot Spratt in the Doctor in the House films. With his bristling beard and commanding presence, he was a larger-than-life figure who lived like a feudal lord in a Scottish castle, surrounded by falconry and fine wines. However, by the mid-1970s, the castle was gone, the fortune had evaporated, and the man himself was a shadow of his former glory. Bankrupt and suffering from a series of debilitating strokes, Justice was living out his final days in a modest cottage in Hampshire, far removed from the grandeur he had once commanded. It was here, on his deathbed, that the final act of his personal drama played out. The woman at his bedside was Irene von Meyendorff, a glamorous Prussian baroness and former actress who had starred in films during the golden age of German cinema. She had been Justice's companion for years, nursing him through his decline as his health failed and his debts mounted. However, they were not legally married. As the end drew near in the summer of 1975, a frantic urgency took hold. The question on the lips of the few remaining friends who visited was simple: why marry now? Justice was penniless, having lost his estate to the taxman and his extravagances. There was no vast fortune to inherit, no sprawling apartment in Mayfair. Yet, the desire to secure the title of Mrs. Robertson Justice became the primary objective. The wedding took place on the 29th of June, 1975. It was one of the most somber ceremonies in show business history. The groom was unable to stand, barely conscious, and arguably unaware of the legal proceedings taking place around him. Just 3 days later, on the 2nd of July, James Robertson Justice passed away. To the cynical observer, the timing was impeccable. Irene had secured the legal status of a widow in the absolute final hours of his life. While there was no cash windfall, the marriage granted her the rights to his name, his image, and the control of his artistic legacy, assets that, in the film industry, can be just as valuable as gold. The deathbed marriage sparked a quiet scandal in British society. Critics viewed it as a macabre formality, a way to ensure that the Baroness would be the one to accept the condolences and the posthumous honors. It was the ultimate waiting game, played until the clock showed just seconds remaining. Irene had nursed him, yes, but the insistence on a marriage certificate while the groom was on the threshold of death sat uncomfortably with the romantic narrative. It felt transactional, a final administrative task to tidy up the estate before the undertaker arrived. In the end, James Robertson Justice died as he had lived, the center of a dramatic scene. His final union serves as a poignant, if slightly grim, bookend to the era. It demonstrated that for the women who attached themselves to the dying legends of the 1970s, the wedding ring was often less about a new beginning and more about securing the ending. Irene walked away with the name of a legend, proving that in the world of the British elite, status is a currency that retains its value even when the bank account is empty.